There are a ton of media and gaming franchises that get their own card game. Talking about stuff like Star Wars, One Piece, Dragon Ball, Digimon, Final Fantasy, I'm pretty sure, Universal Fighting System from Capcom. Yeah, there's that too. But what about our pet game, Dead by Daylight? For those IPs that are big, but not quite big enough to get their own card game, they have found a new home in the ever-growing Magic the Gathering Universes Beyond collection. In the last few years, Magic the Gathering has gone full Fortnite, printing out an absurd amount of crossover material. It started with Transformers and My Little Pony, which kind of made sense because those properties were owned by Hasbro. But then we got The Walking Dead, Street Fighter, Stranger Things, Assassin's Creed. It's getting all over the place. We're looking at Monty Python, Princess Bride, Fallout. It's getting crazy out of hand. Jurassic Park? I got Samuel L. Jackson on my counterspell? It's ridiculous. Now, Dead by Daylight is no stranger to crossover material itself, lending much of its popularity to various licensed characters, such as Ellen Ripley, Leatherface, Albert Wesker, and Naughty Bear. However, Dead by Daylight recently collaborated with none other than Dungeons & Dragons, which is a property owned by Wizards of the Coast, who also happen to own Magic the Gathering. Do you see where I'm going with this?
No secret lair alert! No secret lair alert!
Yes, it's not entirely impossible for Magic the Gathering to soon feature its own Dead by Daylight collaboration cards. As a fan of both games, I had to absolutely take this opportunity to imagine for myself what Dead by Daylight cards could look like in Magic the Gathering. So, just for you guys, I've created 6 Survivor cards and 5 Killer cards to show off what an MTG DBD collaboration could look like. I'm going to read through these cards, assuming that you know how MTG cards work, and then afterwards I'll kind of explain my intention with the design and where I was going with it. I am by no means a game designer or a card designer. I'm just a fan of Dead by Daylight who happens to own a shameful amount of cardboard. Without further ado, onto the cards. Let's start with the survivors. First, we have Nervous Leader, a 1/1 human survivor who costs 1 Orzhov. He has 2 abilities. Leader, whenever Nervous Leader attacks, put a +1/+1 counter on other target survivor. Prove Thyself, activated abilities of creatures you control cost 1 mana less to cast. Energetic Athlete, she's a 1/1 human survivor who costs 1 Izzet. Quick and Quiet, pay 1 mana, and Energetic Athlete gains hexproof until the end of turn. Adrenaline, if you have 5 or more artifacts on the battlefield, Energetic Athlete has haste and first strike. Studious Botanist is a 1/1 human survivor who costs 1 Simic. She has botany knowledge. Tap to add 1 green mana to your mana pool. Empathy, tap to prevent 1 combat damage to target survivor you control. Solitary Survivalist is a 1/1 human survivor who costs 1 Selesnya. Calm Spirit gives him Ward 1. Saboteur, sacrifice Solitary Survivalist to destroy target artifact. Urban Artist is a 1/1 human survivor who costs 1 Dimir. Streetwise, activated abilities of artifacts under your control cost 1 less to cast. Urban Evasion, you may exert Urban Artist as it attacks. If you do, it gains unblockable until end of turn. The last survivor we have is Rugged Scrapper, a 1/1 human survivor who costs 1 Rakdos. Dead Hard, when this creature dies from combat damage, you may pay 1. If you do, return Rugged Scrapper to the battlefield tapped. No Mither, you may cast Rugged Scrapper from your graveyard as long as you control a survivor. Next, let's move on to the killers. First, we have the Trapper, a 2/4 legendary human ranger who costs black, green, and 2. Pay 1 and tap it to create a Bear Trap token. A Bear Trap token is an artifact with sacrifice this artifact, deal 2 damage to target attacking creature. While blocking, the Trapper assigns combat damage equal to his toughness rather than his power. The Wraith is a 2/2 legendary human rogue who costs white, black, and 2. Haste. When the Wraith enters the battlefield, he gains Shroud and unblockable until the end of turn. Tapping the Wraith gives him Shroud until the beginning of your next turn. During your next upkeep, the Wraith gains Shroud and unblockable until the end of turn. The Hillbilly is a 4/2 legendary human peasant who costs black, red, and 2. Haste. When the Hillbilly deals combat damage to a player, destroy target artifact or enchantment. You may exert the Hillbilly as he attacks. If you do, he gains Death Touch and Indestructible until the end of turn. An exerted creature won't untap during your next untap step. The Huntress is a 1/1 legendary human ranger who costs red, green, and 2. When the Huntress enters the battlefield, put 4 +1/+1 counters on her. Remove a +1/+1 counter. The Huntress gains Vigilance and Reach until the beginning of your next turn. During your upkeep, you may tap the Huntress. If you do, put a +1/+1 counter on her. Repeat this until she has at least 4 +1/+1 counters. Lastly, we have the Nurse. She is a 2/2 legendary human cleric for white, black, and 2. She has Ward 2. Whenever a creature dies, the Nurse gains double strike until the end of turn. Sacrifice a creature. Target creature must block the Nurse this turn if able. Okay, so people who play MTG can probably follow along with the design decisions here, but people who don't, it's going to be a bit confusing. For the killers, I wanted to reflect their in-game mechanics. Because if you take into account their lore and you design off of that, there's so much you can do. But if you kind of try to reference their mechanics, it kind of restricts the space a bit and makes it easier to come up with a design. For the survivors, I've introduced an entirely new creature type called Survivor so that they have specific synergies with each other. I wanted to recreate 2 of their perks in the form of their effects and make them basically 1/1 utilities. There was definitely an intent on making the survivors all cost 1 and making them 1/1 and making all the killers cost 4. There was also an intention where these are not legendary creatures and they are not named after the survivors. Rather, the title is kind of like the concept of the survivor and the effects are based more on their perks rather than the character they're based on. This is because in Dead by Daylight, survivors are kind of like skins. Like all the survivors are universally the same, and then the perks are what differentiates them. And the appearance of that survivor and their identity is just like an overlay on that character. So Nervous Leader is represented by Dwight, but it doesn't necessarily have to be Dwight. Like in Dead by Daylight, you could have Dwight's perks, but you could be running them on Jonah or like Ash Williams or something. It doesn't necessarily have to be Dwight. And that's why I chose to make them non-legendary creatures with generic titles like this. This also means that you could have multiple copies of this character on the field, whereas the killers are restricted to a single copy of that killer on the field at one time, because they cannot be replaced. There is only one Trapper, there is only one Wraith, there is only one Hillbilly. I want to talk about some design decisions. Dwight was probably the easiest one to design because there are mechanics like Mentor already in the game. I didn't really know how to represent Bond in game, so I decided to go with Prove Thyself with like a generic like ability cost discount effect. Notably, Leader only affects survivors, but Prove Thyself can be used on any creature in the game. Meg was tough. I really didn't know how to represent Sprint Burst in the game. I guess I could have given her haste or something. But for Quick and Quiet, I was like, okay, how do I represent that she's getting away from something? I'm like, well, give her like an activated ability that gives her hexproof, so it's like she's escaping an effect. And then Adrenaline, I really didn't know how to represent Adrenaline. I could have made an effect where like it only activates if the enemy player has 5 life or less, but I wanted these cards to sort of work in like Commander, in which you have 40 life instead of 20. So instead I went with this version of Adrenaline, where the 5 completed generators are represented by 5 artifacts. 5 artifacts sounds like a lot, but like there's a lot of ways to get 5 artifacts out on the field, and then you'll have a 1/1 with a lot of utility. Claudette was a bit of a tough one too, trying to represent perks like Botany, Empathy, or what the hell is Claudette's third perk, man? What is her third perk? Self-care? Oh yeah, self-care. Yeah, I couldn't really represent self-care in the game. But yeah, Botany was like, okay, you green. A 1/1 that costs 1 that taps for a green is very common in Magic the Gathering. And then Empathy, you can't really like heal creatures in the game, but I'm like, okay, you can prevent damage. So there we go. Jake was a tough one to design, but it's funny because he kind of like, designing these cards for MTG kind of reflects the way they're designed in Dead by Daylight, where for Jake, I was like, I don't know how to give his Saboteur effect value without somehow making him have to sacrifice something, right? And that's kind of like, oh, maybe I could have made it so he can sacrifice himself or sacrifice his own artifact as like a way of like representing a toolbox. That's fine. That'll be in the errata. But yeah, like Calm Spirit, I was like, I don't want to give him hexproof, that's too strong. So Ward 1 is like a weaker version of hexproof. Like that's fine. And then Saboteur, like, okay, a 1/1 that you can sacrifice to destroy an artifact would be like really good, especially if you can revive it or like, you know, repeatedly use it. Be super good. Okay, so Nia too. So I gave her, as streetwise, I gave her a very similar effect to Prove Thyself, except it applies to artifacts instead of creatures. And then for Urban Evasion, I used the Exert mechanic, which I also used for Hillbilly. I used Exert to sort of represent cooldowns or actions that take longer than normal in Dead by Daylight. So for Urban Evasion, it's like, yeah, she can get past you, but it's going to take her longer. So you get the attack in for free, you're unblockable, but she doesn't untap on your next untap step. So that's kind of punishing in a different way. Lastly, we have David. David was a really fun character to design. I was like, how do I represent Dead Hard in MTG? How do I represent No Mither? Like, he can't be injured. He's a 1/1. If he's injured, he dies. So instead, I made it so that Dead Hard is like a pay 1 to revive the creature. It's like how, you know, being David, having Dead Hard just gives you a second chance. So he'll be revived. This also has synergy with Dwight, where Dwight will basically make your Dead Hard completely free. However, Dead Hard only applies to combat damage, so you won't be able to use it on like a spell or an effect that kills David. It can only trigger on combat. However, if he dies to something other than combat, you can recast him with No Mither as long as you control a survivor. So if there's no survivors on the field, it's like, okay, it's like the idea that David has like survivability. However, it won't matter if he's by himself. So he needs to have another survivor on the field, not just a creature, another survivor on the field for him to be recast with No Mither. Let's move on to killers. These were tough to design. The balance is questionable, but honestly, at this point of the game, there's thousands of cards, and if these are intended for commander, they're pretty weak, I would say. For Trapper, I knew I wanted to do artifact tokens as bear traps. I also knew I wanted to give him that Arcades effect where he is stronger on the defense than the offense to kind of represent how Trapper really works. Like he doesn't really work well outside of his territory. He works better within his own network of traps and stuff. I didn't know if I wanted the trap to damage you or to just remove you from combat, but I like the idea of, you know, getting hit with a trap and then Trapper comes up and smacks you before you can get away. So on the offense, he only deals 2 damage. However, on the defense, he deals 4 damage. But on the defense, with a trap, he can do 6 damage, which is crazy. You could also use multiple traps on the same attacker. So the ceiling is endless, technically. The Wraith was a tough one to design. I really wanted to give him Shroud as a way to represent him being completely invisible and undetectable. So he has haste, Shroud, and unblockable on the turn that he enters. So that means he can swing right away, he can't be blocked, and he can't be targeted by anything. But then he loses Shroud. It's like the idea that he needs to cloak again. So in order to cloak again, he has to tap, which means he can't attack. That gives him Shroud for the next 2 turns, and then it gives him unblockable so that he can swing again for free. Again, probably pretty slow for a 2/2. On second thought, I might want to buff him to like a 3/3, just because he costs 4. But there's ways to untap creatures and stuff. Like, I'm sure people could come up with a creative way to use this character. And then if you blink him, he'll have haste, Shroud, and unblockable every time you blink him. Like, there's a lot of ways around this. But yeah, I don't want it to be like a 1-card value engine. Hillbilly, also tough to design. So I wanted to sort of represent low pro and like his ability to destroy palettes. So that's why if he hits a player, he destroys the target artifact or enchantment. And then this also goes with his other effect. So you can exert, so he gains Death Touch and Indestructible. However, he's only dealing 4 damage, so the common idea would be just don't block him. But if you don't block him, then he'll get to destroy one of your artifacts or enchantments. So now you're incentivized to block him, but anything that blocks him will die, and it won't scratch him because he'll have Indestructible. So it's kind of like that lose-lose situation that Billy can actually put you in game. Huntress was a tough one to design as well. I wanted to represent her hatchet mechanic, and the easiest way to do that was with +1/+1 counters. So she starts as a 5/5, but she has to throw a hatchet to be as effective as she needs to be. So if she wants vigilance and reach, which means that she can attack and then still defend, and she can hit flyers, she has to throw a hatchet. She can do this on the offense or on the defense. So you don't have to commit to throwing a hatchet on your turn. You can wait until a flyer attacks and then throw it defensively. And then during your upkeep, you may tap the Huntress to reset her to a 5/5. This represents her reloading phase, how she has to go a second without attacking in order to load up on hatchets again. Lastly, we have the Nurse, who was another tough one to design. She kind of seems more like a typical black and white MTG card. The Ward 2 kind of represents her elusiveness, and then she is like a kind of an Orzhov sacrifice engine. She can, whenever a creature dies, she gains double strike until the end of turn, and then, which seems not that great for a 2/2 that costs 4, but she can sacrifice a creature at will. This means that she can get double strike almost whenever you want, and that also she can take out specific creatures using that ability. And a white black deck really wants a sacrifice engine like this that can sacrifice a creature at will. So I think that of all the cards I designed, this is probably the strongest one in terms of actual MTG deck building. But yeah, again, I'm not like a card designer or anything. I'm not like a pro MTG designer. I don't know that much about it. So if you guys like DBD and you like MTG, I would love to hear your thoughts about card designs or how you would choose to design some other characters in the game. Or if you can come up with any other cards that would fit the sort of DBD MTG crossover. But yeah, just a fun video to share with you guys. Magic the Gathering, Dead by Daylight, forever.